We are having an incredible time with this world-building theme. Not only has it been a long-awaited opportunity to investigate how exactly fictional worlds are built, it's also been an eye-opening look at just how creative the humans in our community can be. To everyone participating in the competition we're running with World Anvil right now, I personally want to let you know that I am awed by your imagination and your skill. Well done! If you aren't participating or you're coming to this video long after the competition has ended, you can find all the information you'll need in this video's description. If you get a chance, go look at the entries. They are inspired. Oh, and be sure to watch until the video's end. It really seems like things are beginning to go somewhere with these strange letters I've been receiving. I've been asked yet another question, and this one, well, it's a lot bigger than the last one they asked. For now though, while the metal is still hot, we're going to show you worldsmiths some new ways to strike it. We started to explore something in our last video called the 3 F's of world building, but we really only focused on one of them. Now it's time to get a little more detailed about all 3. So, take up your hammer, light up the forge, and prepare to build. These are our 3 methods of world building. Free design is, by far, the most popular approach to building fictional worlds, likely because of how simple and unrestricted it is. The other methods on this list are pretty much all about constraints, but with free design, the only constraint you face is the internal logic and consistency of the world you're building. Essentially, the world you create is beholden only to itself and to you. That isn't to say that free design is wild or directionless, though. It can be, but it's also very common for the author to move along a scale of magnitude as they use this method. And on this scale, there are 3 typical directions to move: top-down, bottom-up, and middle-out. A top-down free design begins, of course, at the larger end of the scale. The author begins with the broader details of their world and crafts progressively smaller details from there. For example, the author might decide that they'd like to build a world that lacks gravity. This is a big detail and will out of necessity affect the rest of the design. If there's no gravity, none of the structures will really need load-bearing capacity. Thus, none of the creatures will require skeletons, which means that the inhabitants could reasonably be, say, shapeless, floating amoeboid lifeforms. Bottom-up design, on the other hand, begins at the smaller end of the scale. The author starts with the more minute details of their world and builds into progressively larger ones. For instance, the author might like the concept of common plants that can grow animal cells. This is a relatively small detail. But if that's the case in this world, then the inhabitants don't necessarily need to practice animal husbandry or hunting for meat produce. The author could, from there, justify the world as a relatively pacifist place where not even animals need to kill each other out of necessity for food. Finally, middle-out design starts, obviously, in the middle of the scale. The author begins with the most ubiquitous, moderate details, things which are neither as seemingly inconsequential as the produce of a plant, nor as sweeping in their implications as a law of physics. Let's say the author decides that they'd like the apex species of their world to have evolved from octopi. That could very well justify a world almost entirely submerged in water, an effect on the larger end of the scale. It could also mean that, should this species retain the elasticity of their mollusk ancestors, they could have very simple housing needs. Clusters of cubbyholes attached to a common area might do just fine, an effect on the smaller end of the scale. Top-down, bottom-up, middle-out. There's one thing all of these have in common: a sense of oriented freedom. No constraints beyond the needs of the world itself and the desires of the author. The scale of the decisions the author makes about their world may send ripples through their design, but there is no imperative for where or how they drop that first pebble. This makes free design perfect for larger projects intended to spawn a litter of offshoot works. In fact, it's the method Tolkien used to create Arda and Middle-earth. If you read Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, you can see it in Tolkien's many detailed references to pieces of the world totally irrelevant to the plot, pieces which he had designed independent of the story and was eager to expose wherever he could in the text. By a similar token, free design is also generally the favorite method of tabletop RPG designers, whose job it is to design sandbox worlds for game masters to use in order to rapidly develop their campaigns and settings in. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention one of the best applications of free design: pure love of the craft. Remember, world building is an art unto itself. Don't ever feel forced to build your world for a story or a project, the need to pile constraints onto your design. If what you love is shaping worlds from the ether of your imagination, do it. Feel free to design. At some point during the planning phase of every story, the author has to ask themselves, where is this stuff happening? When is it happening? And this is where fixed design begins, with the need for a setting. That may be a little more complex than it sounds, though. A setting is not just a place where something happens. We went into some detail about this in our first world building video, but for now, suffice it to say that a setting is a place in which a conflict occurs over a duration of time. Without any one of those individual elements, place, conflict, duration, a setting cannot exist. And that's important, because if you were to approach setting using the free design method, altering or removing places associated with that setting however you'd like, you'd effectively be destroying it. Simply put, in the building of worlds, settings are far more difficult to change than other elements. These are the places in the design that are fixed by their obligation to a conflict over a duration of time. The only thing the author can really do with them is begin to answer the slew of questions they beg. For instance, in your loosely medieval European-themed world, if the setting involves a profaned burial ground that now has undead swarming out of it, the nearby townsfolk rushing to stymie the flow, you also have to wonder, what resources do they have to protect themselves? Do they have firearms? Gunpowder? Do they have an organized militia of their own? Are they able to produce enough food on their own to stake out behind the town walls until the blight passes? Any number of particularities that don't concern the rest of your world demanded by this one relatively small setting. Essentially, if you're creating a setting within your world, there is an imperative to flesh it out. This focus is what distinguishes fixed design from free design. Yes, it does offer a constraint, but for writers and storytellers, it's a useful one. It protects the author from wandering off into their design to get forever lost in the anatomy of imaginary insects and the history of fictional family lines. Instead of designing every facet of their world, they focus on those pertinent to the setting. There are two simple approaches to fixed design: the world-based approach and the story-based approach, which are both precisely what they sound like. In the case of a world-based fixed design, the author has already spent time free designing their world, and in the process stumbled across places that they want to tell stories about. So they develop an appropriate conflict, apply it to that place for a duration of time, and then get to work answering all the new questions this marriage begs, so that they can tell a story in their brand new setting. In the case of story-based fixed design, the author has spent time developing an independent conflict and now requires a place for it to happen in for a time. Knowing their goal is to tell a story and not necessarily to build a world, they begin to design specifically within the sphere of their conflict's concerns. This means making decisions about the world based on the story they're planning to tell. If the author knows the hero must slay a beast as a part of their conflict, that creates a need for a beast of some kind within their world. Whether it's a dragon or a great and mighty hippo can make a heck of a difference. What the author doesn't need to decide on is what the mating habits of the common woodlouse look like on the continent next door. By giving themselves the constraint of a setting which needs to be fleshed out, fixed in place within their world, the author is ultimately protecting their story. A world is a large thing to build. If they wait until all of it is finished before they write their story, the story will never be written. So far, we've talked about two different world-building methods based on two different levels of constraint. Free design, where the construction of the world is beholden only to itself, and fixed design, where the construction of the world is beholden to a setting. But however spacious, these are not the only boxes world building can happen within. Often, an author will begin their design with some constraints that have nothing to do with their world or their setting. External considerations like ethical boundaries, concept conveyance, aesthetic cohesion, and so on. It's when, in the middle of their world-building process, the author finds new external constraints or new conflicts between their external constraints and their world that the author stumbles into the realm of found design. We call these external constraints that pop up mid-process or prove to conflict with other parts of the design emergent constraints. When these things crop up, it's common for the author to abandon the parts of the design they conflict with. But found design is the process of finding a compromise between the design and the emergent constraints discovered in the process. On a larger scale, this works very well as a method of selection, which is something we focused on in our previous video. As opposed to deciding which parts of their world ought to be built freely and which parts deserve to be developed into settings, the author can let an emergent constraint guide their decision. This can be as simple as a game master in a tabletop RPG making a decision based on the emergent constraint of their players' preferences. If the players want to go explore a cave system the GM mentioned in passing but never designed, the emergent constraint becomes this cave system must be able to support a setting. In which case, following the method of found design, they don't tell their players, no, that place can't support a setting, but they instead prepare to begin a fixed design for the setting it has to become. On a smaller scale, found design can also actually be a method of building. This is the case when emergent constraints don't lead to the selection of a world-building method, but instead influence the design directly, regardless of the method being used. This can be the result of anything from game designers needing to retroactively marry their world to the game's mechanics, to show writers needing to inflate their world to accommodate new filler arcs. But by far the most common application of found design is in the author's fulfillment of their own desires. Perhaps they've fallen in love with the species of winged serpent they've designed, but the world they want to place it in is a frigid wasteland where it couldn't possibly survive. The emergent constraint becomes, I want this winged serpent to exist in my frozen world. Following the method of found design, they would neither abandon the creature nor warm up their world. They'd adjust aspects of one or both to accommodate the addition. Maybe the atmosphere in this world works differently from Earth's, causing higher points to be warmer, mountain peaks being some of the rare places that actually thaw. And maybe the author's winged serpents roost atop them in order to regulate the temperature of their cold blood. Perhaps they've even evolved coats of white fur instead of scales to better trap and retain the heat. These would be new designs found through addressing emergent constraints. Out of the 3 methods of world building in this video, this is easily the most dynamic. It can apply to virtually any part of the process and can work in tandem with just about any other method. It's not always appropriate to adjust established parts of your world like this, but when it is, when you can find parts of your design rather than just deciding on them, it's like watching your world grow and evolve before your eyes. Well, how was that for dense? We crammed a whole lot into this list, so don't be afraid to backtrack and re-listen to parts of it. We certainly had to do a lot of that while we were putting it together. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next time. Bye!